I think it's sometimes just getting the kickstart of the internal work, letting their company or organization know that there may be a shift to more up-to-date technology, and it's getting those conversations flowing internally ahead of us engaging, I think is quite important, because I don't know about you, Shannon, but I've definitely been put in front of customers before when they don't even know what's going on, and yet we're asking them about their content and they don't know why. And, then we're sort of spending our time explaining why this change is needed, but to them, they just feel like it's happening to them. So any sort of front footing they can do around like internal comms, I think makes our life a bit easier. And then also alongside that, sometimes, cleaning up the content they have already. So it helps cut through the process of us needing to work out at a later date what can be left behind. Any sort of front footing they can do on that, asking their staff to start cleaning up their areas content-wise or prioritizing what they need.
Welcome to another episode of Fresh Perspectives. I am David Bowman, Product Director for Fresh Intranet. I am missing my little buddy Yarbus for this episode, but I'm joined by two guests, and we're going to do Content Hoarders Anonymous. We're going to talk about content migration, the challenges, what works, what doesn't, and I'm joined by two people who have a lot of experience in this area. Zoe, why don't you start and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm a solutions consultant at Advania. I'm a part of the comms and collaboration team alongside my colleague. And we sit within consulting and digital workplace and really do all sorts of projects related to SharePoint, whether that's intranets, migrations for intranet content, or document management, or sort of bespoke SharePoint solutions. But yeah, pass over to Shannon.
I don't have to say anything now. I do exactly the same as Zoe. So there we go. But my name's Shannon.
Wonderful. All right, great. Well, welcome and thanks for joining us. So I thought we'd start out with the, I was going to say quickfire questions, but they're probably not really quickfire questions. Zoe, let's start with you first. What is the biggest migration that you've worked on?
Oh, that is a good question. I think I've had like 20 terabytes would be my biggest in terms of like content size. But yeah, it's usually like huge, more government agencies who have content that spans a whole generation of time and have never gotten rid of anything, and they're sort of wanting to move to the cloud. Sort of the biggest I've seen.
Shannon, same question.
Oh, I feel like I don't know off the top of my head.
They've just all merged into one.
They've all just merged into one. I'd actually say, though, the bigger ones tend to be easier. So they go to the back of my brain. So, but yeah, probably similar.
Okay. All right. I guess in interesting aside then on that question, what about kind of numbers of sites, documents? Do these numbers stick in your head while you're doing these migrations? Is this something you wake up 2:00 in the morning thinking about that time you migrated 10,000 sites from SharePoint Classic?
Oh. Shannon, you've had an experience recently with SharePoint 2016, have you not?
Yes. Which is not quite 10,000 sites, but is enough sites. We're moving like just under 100 sites, but it's just hard to get yourself back into the mindset of SharePoint server and remember everything, and try and also at the same time teach the client about what's going to change while also trying to think about what they've currently got. So I think even when it's a huge number or a small number, there's so much to think about in terms of like re-educating and also making sure that we understand what they've currently got. And usually that's the most difficult part because they don't understand what they've got either.
Yeah. Well, and SharePoint 2016 feels like a long time ago now.
Yeah.
But I think we were having this conversation when we spoke to Kripal Karvi from Microsoft, talking about the sort of legacy of SharePoint. And this is a product that has a long, rich, varied history. I'm old enough to remember when it was introduced. So it isn't a surprise to find customers that are on very old versions of SharePoint, and often in most of those cases, I guess in my experience, customers don't tend to delete a lot of data. Have you ever had anything that was particularly old or weird that you've migrated, Shannon?
Not super weird, definitely old. We find a lot of like Christmas party pictures from
Right.
like 2009 or something like that, or like employee of the month from like 2005 or something crazy. They're the funny ones, and it's so hard to just like not have a quick flick through and see where they were in Christmas
Yeah.
2008 or whatever.
Well, that doesn't sound like that long ago. To be honest, it would be, for me, the pictures from Christmas parties in the 1990s would be far worse. Zoe, what about you? Anything weird, unusual, very old?
I think, Shannon's probably covered the weird. I think it's often photos that it sort of hit the weird category for people wanting to move across. But in terms of old, I've definitely had, we run reports in a migration, which, pull back to, I guess, metadata on all sorts of documents. And sometimes, it's things that haven't been touched in 20 years, yet somehow it's still on the table to be migrated. And it's, something no one knows about, hasn't used, probably couldn't even find it in their current system. But those sorts of discussions are all on the table, and a lot of customers still want to migrate those things. So maybe, in my opinion, that would be a weird case, because I'm not sure why you would want to keep a document no one even knew existed.
Particularly the Christmas party photos.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we've talked about before, and it's a question that when you meet a customer for the first time, and you're showing a demo of intranet, so you're talking about SharePoint in sort of fairly general sense, and what they're describing is, we've got a lot of content from a lot of places, and we need you to help us migrate it. What are your experiences in those conversations with customers? Because often how what they're describing in the sort of first conversations to what ends up happening at the end of the project can feel very different. Talk a little bit about your experiences there.
I think for me, obviously, when you're having an initial conversation, it's usually coming from one person or one part of the business, whether that's the IT team or someone else. And I think they have a vision of, okay, we can just lift everything over, or we can just take this. And I think when we have that initial conversation, something that we tend to push for is actually, no, we need to speak to people across the business, different owners of this content, and get a clear picture about what is being used, what isn't being used. And I think sometimes when a client comes and says, we want to do a migration, they just think it's going to be like a tick box, yes, no, we're taking this, when actually a lot of it is about having conversations with heads of divisions or people who own the content to understand what's there and what's actually needed.
Yeah, same experience, Zoe.
Yeah, virtually the same. It's easy for, I guess, people at a high level, especially IT, to sort of oversimplify and think we can just lift all the content over here into SharePoint Online. But there's a lot of complexities once you talk to actual users of that content, owners, all sorts of different workflows they might have in place. And I think a huge important piece of migrations is obviously like the user experience out the other side, which IT teams love to forget about or think isn't important. That there's a huge technical element of the migration, but at the end of the day, it's talking to the users and actually understanding how we need to structure the solution to actually make it work for them on the other side.
I guess it's sort of somewhat amusing, kind of in those conversations, and that what they're describing is a situation where people are getting poor results in search and they can't find anything. And then you get into the conversation about content migration, and what you get is, well, we'd like to move everything over to the new environment. So, well,
just as
you're gonna bring your problems with you. This isn't necessarily going to resolve everything. So, I guess what it sounds like is, kind of key point in those early stages of the project is to start uncovering the value of the content from the people that are closest to it. Is that a sort of fair statement?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. If we can, it's sort of running workshops sort of with each department, definitely content owners. And it's the only way you can really understand those complexities, I think, rather than, talking to more like a high level project team.
And when when you're in there having conversations then with the people that are a bit closer to the content, do you find that there's a good level of understanding about what they've got, what they own, how useful, how valuable, or is that the first time that they're hearing about a lot of this stuff?
I'd say it really varies. I've definitely met with people where they it shocks me how little they actually know about their content and, even like where they should be saving it. But then other times you really find empowered users who have taken ownership and have, used the technology they have to create like a robust storage if it's for documents, or like a structure that really works for them in the team. But yeah, on the flip side, you can go in sometimes and they can't help us at all.
Yeah. Same experiences, Shannon.
Yeah, exactly the same. It's just so varied. Like Zoe said, it's either people are really invested and spend a lot of time managing, their folder structures, no matter how deep they are, or they just go, oh, I just save it wherever, and there's just nothing. So there tends to not be a happy medium. It's either one extreme or the other.
Right. Okay. Well, and that, I guess that's in some ways is reassuring, because you at least know what you're walking into in most instances. And for the people that that you meet that do have a really good sense of their content and understand it really well, what are the sort of attributes of the people or the content of the organization that makes a difference there? What's the magic ingredient that you find?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's often the nature of the person. It's someone who likes organized, sets of folders and something looking clean. They're usually the ones who are all on top of their content and, know exactly where things should be going. I also find in terms of like organizations, if there's any sort of auditing, that sort of, any of that in place, that they need to be able to find things and know stuff still exists and get to it. They are also the type of organizations that seem to care a lot more about how their content is structured and that it's findable.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I could probably bring to mind the names of sort of 4 or 5 customers where I could imagine that person would have a really good handle on their content. I think we probably share some of the names on our list would be would be the same names, I think.
Probably.
What and when the project is unfolding, right, and you're kind of in these conversations, you've got that sort of high level instruction from IT about we need to move everything. You're starting to kind of get into the details a little bit with the people in the organizations. What are the common challenges that you're coming across in those projects? Are there patterns? Are there things that every organization struggles on, or is it different every time, Shannon?
I think for me, a lot of it is like changes in behavior. I tend to find like when we're, moving over, is the deep file structures, and they're just wanting to create a new folder for everything.
Right.
And it's trying to kind of change the behavior slightly of like moving to more best practice of trying to keep it 3 folder levels deep. Then it will really help you find stuff. Trying to introduce metadata that maybe they weren't doing before. I think that's a fear for a lot of people of like, well, we've been saving stuff like this for ages. I just create a new folder and put version 3. Blah, 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 blah. And then if we come in and we're like, well, we're going to move stuff, but why don't we try moving like this? This is what it's going to improve. And that's where I find a little bit of fear from people, especially if they've been working in a certain way for a long time.
Zoe?
Yeah, I would say a complexity or challenge I find across the board is always permissions as well. Because, lots of sort of legacy systems, like the way they did permission management, is often vastly different to how it sort of works in SharePoint Online, and especially with our best practice, we don't usually like to start creating unique permission levels once you sort of get to folders. So it's that sort of restructures can cause, I guess, just complexities with how we migrate or like reset up permissions, especially now obviously with Copilot. It becomes even more important how permissions are managed in terms of their SharePoint structures. So for a lot of, customers, a huge benefit of moving to SharePoint Online are those more AI capabilities sort of at their fingertips. But then if they're just moving over legacy permissions and they're not even sure what permissions they have set up, it definitely, I guess, creates more work for them in the future if it's not something handled as part of the migration, but to do more like Copilot readiness. Is like a
just want to as Microsoft would say, I want to double click on a couple of things that you mentioned there. While we try to not cringe too hard from my use of that expression. Shannon, you were talking a little bit about metadata, and this is a really important concept in SharePoint, which I think is often overlooked. I wonder if you'd just be able to talk a little bit about why this is important.
Yeah, so essentially with metadata, I mean, the first description of it is it's information or data about data, right? When we use metadata, it really improves search and findability of documents. So like if users are using search in SharePoint and their search terms are matching metadata that's been attached to a document, we're going to see more relevant and accurate results. It also means that, especially in SharePoint Online, we can create different views based on metadata rather than going into those deep file structures. I think it's a new concept to quite a lot of organizations, which I think is strange to us because we talk about metadata so much. But I think especially with search being so prominent in like intranets and SharePoint now, once you try like do a few demos, explain how it can help with search and findability, they see the benefit of it, but getting them to fill it out is a different story, but it's definitely a big change in behavior for some organizations.
Yeah, completely agree. I think it's often one of those things that produces quite a lot of eye-rolling moments when you start talking about metadata with people. But I think the moment that people see the benefit that it has and the value that it can add in a well-structured environment, it's super powerful. And I think particularly for people that have moved from sort of file share type structures into SharePoint, they've brought that kind of it sounds wrong to say kind of legacy mindset about how they're going to store data. And it is, as you say, kind of reconfiguring someone's behavior to be, think about it in metadata, shallow stores of content that's going to produce the best result there. The other one that I want to talk pick up on there, Zoe, you're talking a bit about how important this is for Copilot now, particularly. And I think, as we're all seeing people coming, back to SharePoint or thinking about their content management strategy in SharePoint because of Copilot. There is a huge connection between the kind of quality of the outputs in Copilot and how people are thinking about, as you say, permissions, but also having loads and loads of old data, incorrect information, that kind of stuff. Can you talk a little bit about any views that you have on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as you alluded to, it's the sort of like versionings and knowing, what document is this like latest source of truth is definitely a massive part of that. So I suppose in the context of migrations, it's us not migrating sort of duplicates of documents, for example, where, they've all got the same name with a V1, V2, V3 at the end. It's actually doing that sort of, reconciliation as part of a migration as well. So we're bringing in and using like the versioning, I guess, as the part of SharePoint, where it's just one document and the versions are tracked within it, I think is a huge part of knowing, what you can pull back in Copilot results is the latest document is definitely like a massive part of that. And then, of course, with permissions, it's really just making sure if there's, secure documents that they are correctly security trimmed. And, I think it's empowering like a more IT technical team to use some of the functionality within, if that's, SharePoint Premium or something where there's, so you can do reporting and actually have, that oversight of correct sort of security trimming within your content and structures, I think is really important before sort of hitting the go button on Copilot.
Yes. And I guess ultimately, whether that's for a user interface like an intranet or answers in Copilot, the better structured, the better permissioned, the less duplicates, the less incorrect information, the better the outcomes are going to be all around. There's a sort of obvious positive to that work.
Yeah.
All right. I've allowed myself to become a little bit distracted, but a couple of important points to pick up on there. Just want to talk about, we get into lots of conversation about content migration and this kind of scripting versus automation through tools versus manual. Zoe, I wonder if you could just give us a bit of an introduction to, how you guys think about the use of those different approaches and, broadly what they cover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I would suppose it depends what type of content we are migrating, primarily around more like intranet or page-based content. We've gone the more manual approach I think is the usual standpoint where it's actually quite a recreation of pages, like a copy and paste into new web parts and formats. I think previously we've used ShareGate for a page migration. We do have a subset of Shannon and I's team who are the technical experts that usually run those sort of toolings, and that's, I guess, said quite the same with the larger, more sort of document management based migrations as well. I think where possible, we usually go for like a SharePoint native tooling, so like the SharePoint migration tool. Or I think ShareGate is commonly used as like a first
Plug
step.
for ShareGate.
Exactly.
Other migration tools available.
But then I guess I can't speak for the super technical guys in our team, but I'm sure there's scenarios when those don't fit, and then there is always like custom scripting that might need to be completed to sort of make sure we can get content across into SharePoint Online.
Shannon, any additional thoughts on kind of approaches, methods, tools?
Not really. Just to reiterate that what we tend to find is if we're maybe migrating from an intranet to an intranet, a lot of the pages are manual, which me and Zoe have sat, I know, previously and recreated many, many pages. But then usually if it's more of like a DMS, things like that, that is where either the tools, automation, or the scripts can be useful rather than downloading, re-uploading. We tend to try and script that or use a tool. But anything kind of page or news post related, we sit down and put our headphones on for a good few hours and redo it.
Is there a particularly good type of music to listen to while doing content migrations?
I feel like me and Zoe have very different ideas on this.
Well, I would have gone for Slipknot or something. I'd need the distraction for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I won't press you on your musical choices. And just to sort of pick up on the, you were talking about kind of intranet migrations and pages, and I guess correct me if I'm wrong in the assumption on this one, but because that's graphical user interface, people are going to be hitting those pages. An automatic migration might not create something that's going to look nice or make best use of the features or functionality. Is that the kind of influencing factor to that?
Yeah, it's definitely a part of it. And also it's, we're making use of web parts and sort of key functionality, I think, on pages where, you can't necessarily migrate content in. It requires like configuration front end. So even if we can get, text content across, which I think is what we did when we have used ShareGate before, it's just, unfortunately, like the technology does require sort of front end configuration. And absolutely, it's like adding imagery into a page. My lights just turned back on. But it's like there's definitely, I guess, more visual elements which just require configuration rather than just us hitting a button and everything gets spat out the other side.
It does feel like the sort of content that probably needs a bit more consideration. And I guess the advantage there is that what you also don't want is a kind of brand new, fresh intranet. Excuse the use of the word there, with a lot of content that's years old, that's going to clog up search and isn't actually going to be that helpful for anyone.
Yeah, we usually try and redirect them to just recreate or re-migrate really vital pages, but otherwise it is a massive opportunity to start fresh and have more of like a blank canvas to at least like their news content and some of the key informational pages. It almost forces the customer, I think, to relook at what they've got and bring some life back into it.
And DMS, document management system, I guess that's feels a little bit more transactional from a kind of content migration perspective.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah,
okay.
That's where we tend to see a lot more of like the lift and shift, or we create a new document library and we can move it over kind of thing, which you can't tend to do in an intranet.
Yeah. Okay. Where do things go wrong? I'm specifically referring to content migrations. I'm not asking a question.
I guess one that I have kind of worked through recently is like agreeing on new structure, for example. Like if we're wanting to change library structure or So, for example, I've just been working with a client where they were using subsites still, and we've now moved them out to a flat SharePoint structure, and working with them to understand what their new document libraries need to be, and agreeing what their folder structure should be and what their naming convention should be, rather than just lifting and shifting, has been quite challenging, and has been kind of like, well, we have the subsites now, why do we need to change? So it's explaining why we're changing, and then also getting them to think about what the change will be, and then we can actually do the migration. So it's like a lot of steps before we even get to that migration point.
And I was going to add to that, sometimes the technical piece is the easiest, and where it all falls over is when we sort of wave goodbye at the door and it's up to them to adopt it. I've previously done like a migration where the customer was really willing. They wanted to get all on board with Microsoft Teams. We did massive amount of team facing sort of front end, and actually SharePoint was just the back end file storage. But then when it came to users actually working, and Teams was just too much of a jump for them. They couldn't wrap their head around it, and therefore they just kept saving their files locally. And so all the work we had done sort of didn't get adopted, which is why I think, having good communications and training and ongoing from the solution going live to sort of reinforce behaviors is, sometimes the biggest part.
Yeah, I think you're almost back to, the beginning of the conversation about kind of, when you are starting a project, the expectation about, a content migration being a sort of a mechanical, technical thing. I think what people probably undervalue in there is the importance of making sure that the people that are actually using it are going to use it in a slightly different way. I mean, however minor that is, it still requires a change of behavior, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and then we talked a little bit about people being a kind of key success ingredient in here. Having a good understanding of their content and information, and I think for organisations maybe where there aren't a significant number of those people, because they are rare. Are there other things that if people listening are starting to think about content migration from whatever to whatever? What are the things that you would like them to think about before connecting with Advania UK or some other vendor to talk about content migration? What's gonna help them make this better?
It's a hard question.
I think it's sometimes just getting the kickstart of the internal work, as in making, letting their company or organization know that there may be a shift to more up-to-date technology, and it's getting those conversations flowing internally ahead of us engaging, I think is quite important, because I don't know about you, Shannon, but I've definitely been put in front of customers before when they don't even know what's going on, and yet we're asking them about their content and they don't know why, and then we're sort of spending our time explaining why this change is needed, but to them they just feel like it's happening to them. So any sort of front footing they can do around like internal comms, I think makes our life a bit easier. And then also alongside that, sometimes cleaning up the content they have already, so it helps cut through the process of us needing to work out at a later date what can be left behind. Any sort of front footing they can do on that, asking their staff to start cleaning up their areas content wise, or prioritizing what they need, I think is important.
Shannon, any additional?
I don't think so, but yeah, I've definitely had a lot of panicky conversations with people from teams where they go, "Oh, when is this happening? I need to look at my data. Don't do it yet." And you kind of go, "No, we're not doing it right now. We're just trying to have a conversation." Yeah. But yeah, cleanup is important, and I always, trying to avoid naming conventions that don't make sense, or you're never going to remember what that document actually is. Avoiding like the duplicates as well. You work on a document, you download it, you re-upload a new one, trying to avoid and just get into that kind of best practice when it comes to file storage, which can be difficult. But I think the first step is definitely just to say to people in the organization, go and have a look at what you've got. Is there anything you definitely don't need? And can you have a little think about everything else? And then it usually sets us up with a good initial starting point.
So a bit of internal comms, a bit of priming to get people ready that there's something going to happen. Not setting the pulses racing by having a bit of preloading to a bit of work. And I mean, it sounds like ultimately not treating it as a technology project. I think that kind of feels like a good summary based on what you said there.
100%.
Yeah, I would agree. And maybe just to add to that, well, it is more of at a high level. Sometimes it's the organization actually forming a digital strategy for themselves. So, you know, migrating into the cloud or SharePoint Online is just the first piece of the puzzle. But I think sometimes if they can form a broader picture of their actual strategy and where they want to go from there, I think it would make definitely their experience and understanding of where they could go in the future also helps with that buy-in and on why they need to move up to the cloud for all the other benefits that could come in the future.
Absolutely. And, you know, I couldn't echo what you said any harder about, you know, making sure that people understand the why on these things, right? You know, you're being asked to do something that is potentially pretty annoying, is going to take time out of your day that you don't really have anyway. It's not a fun job digging through the Christmas photos that you stored in your OneDrive somewhere. But, you know, actually understanding that there's a significant benefit to user experience, to content, to improving answers through AI that, you know, I think people deserve a bit of explanation as to why some of these things are happening. All right. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you joining us and sharing your thoughts on content migration.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.